Thanks. Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's actually the first time I've spoken in Oregon. I'm sorry, not in Oregon. I've actually spoken many times in Oregon, but my first time speaking in Portland, and my first time coming to this wonderful bookshop, Powell's, and it's really a treat. I've heard so much about it, so I'm just thrilled to be here and to see all of you turn out on a Wednesday night. I wanted to start with a quote from a politician, and the politician is somebody from the North Shore of Illinois, just outside of Chicago, and this is a quote where he's talking about Halliburton in war and the contracts they've gotten. So this is the quote. He talks about these contracts that were illegal by statute. He's speaking on the floor of Congress. He says, he urges a high-level probe into the 30-year associational, personal and political between a particular politician and the company. And he asks whether asks him to consider the fact that the company had contributed money to the President's Club while Congress was considering whether to award another multi-million-dollar project to Brown & Root. Brown & Root is a subsidiary of Halliburton that does the work in war zones. And he noted that he says over here, why this huge contract has not been and is now not being adequately audited is beyond me. The potential for waste and profiteering under such a contract is substantial. And he talks about the fact that this company, has no receipts, and they are overcharging, and he's really kind of upset. And the most interesting thing about this is that you might imagine this is Henry Waxman from Los Angeles talking about Iraq, but it isn't. It's actually Donald Rumsfeld in May 1966, and he's talking about Vietnam. So now remember that Donald Rumsfeld is and always has been a Republican, and the president he was referring to was Lyndon B. Johnson. And I say that because it's very important to note that Lyndon Johnson, as probably all of you know, was a Democrat. And in fact, the politicians that really ran the Vietnam War were Democrats rather than Republicans. Not that the Republicans didn't have a part to play in this. What I want to read for you next is a quote from September 10th, 2001. Let me get the right page here. And on September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld, now at the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense, says, "The topic today is an adversary that poses a threat, a serious threat to the security of the United States of America. That adversary is one of the world's last bastions of central planning. It governs by dictating 5-year plans. From a single capital, it attempts to impose its demands across time zones, continents, oceans, and beyond. You may think I'm describing one of the last decrepit dictators of the world," he says. He said also, "it disrupts the defense of the United States and places the lives of men and women in uniform at risk. The adversary is close at home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy. The technology revolution has transformed organizations across the private sector, but ours, not fully, not yet. We are, as they say, tangled in our anchor chain. We must ask tough questions. Why is it that the DoD, the Pentagon, is one of the last organizations around the world that still cuts its own checks? When an entire industry exists to run warehouses around the world, why do we own and operate so many of our own? At bases around the world, why do we pick up our own garbage and mop our own floors rather than contracting services out as many businesses do?" I make this comment simply partly to show the transition between Rumsfeld, the opposition politician in the 1960s, and 35 years later, where he's embraced the idea of using Halliburton and Brown & Root in the war in Iraq. But also because Halliburton's Army, the book was originally called Halliburton's War, but in fact I realized partway through writing this book that I was making a mistake. And this isn't really about a war for Halliburton or by Halliburton, it's a war that is actually conducted by Halliburton in some ways. And I'll explain that. If you go to Iraq today, there are 300,000 people supporting the US military. About a half of those are soldiers, and the other half are private contractors. So for every soldier, there is a private contractor. And contrast this to the first Gulf War, where there was 1 in perhaps 20 people that was a private contractor. So what Rumsfeld had intended when he spoke in 2001 has happened. Today, half of the work in the field is actually done by private contractors. And out of the 150,000 people that are there in Iraq, private contractors, 50,000 work for what was part of Halliburton, but now is a separate company called KBR. So technically Halliburton has gone from Iraq. Its former subsidiary, this was the company that worked in Vietnam, is now a totally different company in Houston, and they're called KBR. So today if you go out and you call Halliburton and say, what are you doing in Iraq? Are you profiteering? They'll say, we've never been in Iraq. It's a kind of an astonishing statement, but that's the statement they make. We've never been there. It's always been this company called KBR, and they're a completely separate company now. So you might wonder how this happened and whether or not this was simply, you know, the question people always ask me is they say, what did Cheney have to do with this? Did Cheney give them the contract? Is he making trillions? Somebody said trillions, which is a large sum of money. They said no bid contracts. This is all illegal. They're doing they're doing very bad services for the troops. You know, there's bad water. People are getting electrocuted. They're overcharging, and people ask me to speak about this and explain this. And now I've personally been to Iraq now 4 times, to Afghanistan a couple of times, to Kuwait, Dubai. And the last time I went to Iraq, I embedded with the US military. So when I said I wanted to observe military logistics up close, and they said fine, and they invited me in, and I got to meet Halliburton's Army in person and see exactly what happened. And when I emerged from that, somebody the other day when I gave this talk, somebody said, you've been seduced, you know, you've been the military has bought you up. What I want to say here is, I think I've learned something very different from what I set out to believe about the profiteering, the no-bid contracts. And that's why I brought it back to Rumsfeld. This, as the subtitle of the book suggests, which is how a well-connected Texas oil company revolutionized the way America makes war, is really about a change in the way the US military does business. So today, if you go to Iraq, and you, as a soldier or as a diplomat, or if you're Barack Obama is probably going to go to Iraq. He's been to Iraq and he's been to Afghanistan. He's probably going to go pretty soon. When he arrives in Iraq, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to meet people from KBR. When he sits down to eat, the food that he eats will be cooked by people from KBR, ex-Halliburton. If he travels in a convoy, between the airport and the green zone, it's going to be driven by KBR people. If he were to, when we traveled between bases, the flight manifests were written by civilians. So everything there, the building of the bases, the cooking of the food, the cleaning of the toilets, everything that is mundane, that doesn't involve firing a gun, is done by the workers of KBR. So how did this happen? How did this transformation take place? I mean, was this something that the neocons introduced, that Cheney introduced purely for profit? The answer actually is a little more complicated and I think much more interesting. That's kind of what the book is about. It actually dates back, you can actually go back to the Second World War and you can see Brown and Root, the company we're talking about now, the subsidiary of Halliburton. It wasn't a subsidiary then. It was building ships for the Second World War. There's a company called Brown Ship. It went from building roads to building ships and then building military bases in places like Corpus Christi. And then in Vietnam, in fact, when Rumsfeld went to visit and he observed all this up front and came back and said, this is a company that's profiteering, he was observing the consortium of 4 companies led by Brown and Root that was building every base in Vietnam. Those of you that might be older might actually remember the company at the time was dubbed Burn and Loot because of its role in Vietnam. It was and always has been a big construction company under the Democrats, under LBJ. Fast forward to 1982, under Ronald Reagan, they get the contract to build a big base in Diego Garcia. Fast forward to 1996, and the first major logistic contract under which they were cooking food and cleaning toilets and that sort of thing was actually done under the administration of Bill Clinton, because this is Bosnia and Kosovo. So the first major contracts in which Halliburton / Brown and Root provided everything to the troops dates back to those years. So what Rumsfeld was talking about was continuing a tradition that had been started by the Democrats. Now this is, I'm apolitical. I don't vote, I'm not a US citizen, I don't even have a green card. But I think it's very important to understand that the Pentagon And the bureaucracy and the diplomats often operate quite independently of the voting system that you participate in as citizens. And it is a continuum. So, excuse me. As I mentioned, there are about 50,000 people in Iraq that do the work for the soldiers. And I will show you a PowerPoint a little later. I wanted to get over some of the issues so we could just go through it very quickly. But when you get to Iraq, this is not like the kind of war that you might have imagined in the Second World War. People aren't living on, you know, powdered eggs and powdered coffee and powdered milk. You know, it's not even Vietnam, you know, when you're subsisting on, you know, or the first Gulf War where you're subsisting on meals ready to eat, which are these little packets, you know, that you can instantly heat and eat out of. If you go to Iraq today, in most of the bases, the big bases, you will find a full menu of food, and you will be able to get 5 kinds of food. There's a short order chef that provides, you know, Mongolian barbecues. You can have apple pie, you can have pumpkin pie, you can have steak, you can have, and this is every single day. And you know, and then, you know, in Easter, and I'll show you a slide of that too. During Easter, you get, you know, chocolate-covered bunnies. This is a very different military from what existed in Vietnam and the Second World War. And so when I saw that, I was a little surprised, because I came there expecting to see, you know, this, you know, people angry because, you know, the food they got was bad and the water was bad and that sort of thing. So I was a little surprised to see that in fact they had this very extensive menu. And I started to understand a little bit more about things after I spent a little time there. What we're talking about here, now I have to explain to you who exactly Halliburton's Army is, because I've told you there are 50,000 people, but these 50,000 people are largely what are called TCNs, third country nationals. So you will read stories about people who've gone over to work for Blackwater and Halliburton, and they'll be paid $1,000 a day, which is on the high side. But the bulk of these people are actually people from India, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and throughout primarily Asia, poorer parts of Asia, Fiji. And they're not working for $80,000 a year. They're working for $300 a month. And their job is cleaning toilets. And their job is cooking food. So this Rumsfeld revolution, and remember again now, the Pentagon often talks about the revolution in military affairs. And when they're talking about that, they're talking about, you know, the satellite-guided missiles, that, you know, the unmanned aerial vehicles, you know, how they can watch, you know, if you watch Hollywood, you'll see, you know, Hollywood perhaps exaggerates a little bit, but it is true that the Pentagon can see into, you know, villages, and they can, you know, they have night vision goggles and heavy armor for the soldiers. But one of the things that has changed, other than the technological change, is the system of logistics, which Halliburton does, but also the social framework in which this happens. The soldiers who went to Vietnam were draftees, right? They had to go to war. I mean, unless they were Dick Cheney or George Bush, in which case they didn't have to go to war. But so long as you were an ordinary American, you had to go to war. And once you got to the jungles of Vietnam, you had to peel potatoes, or clean toilets, or do whatever it is they told you to do. Today, the US is a volunteer army. You cannot sign people up to go peel potatoes in the desert. They won't go. Or if they figure it out, they might leave. Now, one of the big things that they discovered in Vietnam, by the end of Vietnam, people were indulging in something called fragging. You know, they shot their commanding officers. There were people smoking pot. There were people getting drunk. There were people who went AWOL. By the time the Vietnam War ended, some estimates that have been given, and maybe, you know, this is lefty talk, so maybe it's not true, I don't know. Half of the soldiers weren't actually fighting. Maybe it was more, maybe it was less. But they had a serious morale problem. So in some ways, over this period of time, between Vietnam and the invasion of Iraq, the US military has been transformed, and it's to answer those questions of morale. And it is also to answer the fact that in today's America, you expect, you know, to be able to, you expect to have, you know, running water, hot water. You expect to have, you know, food on demand. You're not used to the kind of, you know, 30-day marches through marshes of, you know, the Second World War, or island hopping in. It's a very different military we're talking about. And in order to be able to make this military work efficiently, Rumsfeld and his crew and people before him have created this streamlined logistical system by which they use workers from other countries to be able to go to war. The question, of course, you've got to ask is what's going to happen next? You know, now that Obama's in charge, will he change this? The answer is it's really not possible anymore. The US military no longer has the logistical capability. They no longer have the quartermaster battalions, you know, that can actually muster in the war in Yugoslavia. They were trying to get a lot of their equipment from Germany to former Yugoslavia, to Bosnia, but they didn't have enough trucks. They had to hire in KBR, Brown and Root, to come in and drive that. And today now, and of course, again, I'm getting to somewhat technical details here, is shipping and moving of goods has moved from what the military used to call break bulk to what's called containerization. If you go to a port, you'll see these giant containers, you know, it says Hanjin or Maersk or whatever. Everything moves like that. And the commercial world already has the means to be able to move things into war. So today, when we, in Afghanistan, when the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, things moved very quickly. Very small force, you know, a lot of money paid to local people to fight. But once you got to 2003, it was what they call a pre-positioned war. The US moved vast quantities of material into the deserts of Kuwait. They built camps. They employed workers from India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and they set up a war. And now the US has no capability of operating any other way. And the commanders like this because it makes it so much easier for them to say, pick up a gun, go and shoot, or, you know, sit in front of a computer screen, push a button, whether it's in Virginia or Anaconda in Iraq, and shoot somebody. It has become a very streamlined system of war, and this is kind of pretty dangerous in my opinion. Whether or not it will change is, you know, something we'll find out. But when I was in Kuwait this last time, I talked to one of the commanders, and I said, and he was the guy who was in charge of the trucking supplies in. And he told me about how the first time he trucked in supplies, the drivers didn't know how to drive, and you know, they were from Fiji, and they went to use these big 18-wheeler American trucks, you know, and they crashed them, etc. And I said, well, I have evidence that the company, it was a Kuwaiti company that applied for that contract, was not qualified and never should have gotten the contract. I said, I will give you that evidence. Will you do something about it? And he said, no. And I said, what do you mean no? This is taxpayer money. It's being wasted. You told me yourself these guys couldn't drive. You know, you know that this is a $1 billion contract that was obtained by fraud. Why would you say no? He says, because it works now. And the soldiers get fed today. We had some teething problems, but it's been worked out. I don't want to go back to a time where people, you know, one of the public affairs officer who was showing me around said, you know, we used to eat chili mac, you know, unstrained hamburger mixed in with, you know, with macaroni. Now, you know, you have steak and apple pie, and you can have pizza, and on every base there's, you know, there are Pizza Huts and there are Burger Kings and there are malls and that sort of thing. So you're looking at a very different military today, and it has been transformed by, in many ways, the involvement of companies like Brown and Root. I wanted to talk a bit about, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I want to keep this at probably no more than half an hour so that you can ask questions. Okay, maybe another 10 minutes. One thing to understand about the workers, so I said 50,000 people work for Brown and Root, 40,000 of them at least are probably third country nationals. I don't want to suggest that America's created this system of, you know, colonial workers in Iraq, because in fact this is a system that in fact is in place throughout the Middle East. If you go to Dubai, for example, 85% of the population of Dubai are foreign workers. 70% are from the South, from South Asia, from India, primarily. And so if you go to Dubai, in fact, people ask me, they say, how do you go to places like Dubai if you don't speak Arabic? I said, because I speak Hindi. Not very well, but I do. Is that almost everybody who operates everything there is from South Asia, or they're from the Philippines. So the system of having poor migrant labor, just as, you know, in the United States we have labor from Mexico or Guatemala, in the Middle East, the people with the oil bring in labor from India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Now, interesting enough, that was also true in Iraq. When Iraq was wealthy, 20 years ago, when they went to war with Iran, all the Iraqi men went to the front to fight Iran. So they didn't have men to do a lot of jobs in Iraq. So they imported people from Egypt. Probably 1 million Egyptians came to Iraq to do that work. So the system that the US is using today in Iraq is in fact a system that has existed for 40 years in the Middle East. And in fact, it's probably an age-old system. You can actually go back to Charles de Gaulle in the liberation of France from the Nazis, where half of his army was in fact, there were probably 500,000 troops, but half of them were North Africans. They were from Algeria, from Morocco, from Tunisia. And like the workers in the Middle East today or in Halliburton's army, these are people without rights. These are people who get paid a lot less than the American soldiers, or in Charles de Gaulle's Second World War, the French soldiers. They don't get home leave. You know, once you get there, you're stuck there. I met a woman. She was working for the US military, but previously she worked for a Kuwaiti employee. She had 2 children in the Philippines, and then she got a job in Kuwait. She came to Kuwait, and then I said, so, you know, how long before you went back to see your children? She said, you know, 9 years. I said, oh, did they come to visit you in between? She said, no. My job, in order to be able to make money for my family, was I had to go and live there for 9 years and send the money back. So she never saw her children grow up because this is really the system. And the thing is, this is in fact a system, sadly, which is very true in the United States too. It is a system of migrant labor that, you know, we can go to war or we can go shopping because somebody else is manufacturing goods in China and somebody else is, you know, doing the work. You know, in Washington, Mexican workers pick the apples or whatever it is. So, but that has now transformed the US military itself. And so the US military, when it goes to war, brings people in. Now, some of these people don't know they're going to war. And they think they're going to Dubai, they're going to Kuwait, you know, and they're going to save up money and go back. And when they discover they're in a war zone, you know, some people get pretty upset and they want to go back. Especially, you know, if it becomes a number of these workers have been killed. They lined up 12 Nepali workers and killed them. You know, there was a bomb blast, killed, you know, Filipino workers. So when people want to get out of there, it becomes very hard because they don't have their passports and they can't just go and, you know, hitch a flight out of there. They have to be able to go out into Iraq, which in itself is a very dangerous place. In the last 2 years, the US military has changed the rules and said that every worker needs to have their passport with them. So if they want to leave, they can. But here's the rub, is in order to get a job on a US military base, you pay $4,000 on average. I've done sort of an informal survey talking to lots of workers from the Philippines, from Fiji, from India, and said, how much did you pay to get this job? They paid $4,000 to get that job back at home, which they have to pay off. Which, if you're earning $300 a month, means it's going to take you a year of wages just to, more than that, just to pay it off. So why use labor like this? And the answer is very simple. In order to get an American soldier to Iraq, you have to put him through, or her, through boot camp. That costs the US military $100,000, probably more. And then once they're there, after 4 years, they can leave. And after that, you have to provide them with college tuition. You have to provide them with veterans benefits. You know, it's a very expensive undertaking to have a soldier. So for people like Rumsfeld, and we get back to the whole, you know, the sort of the Cheney and Bush-Cheney administration, these people are ideologues. And rather than just, you know, saying, well, this is just about money and Cheney making 5% or $1 trillion, I think it's more important to understand that this is actually a continuum of the US military trying to figure out how to be able to wage war in other countries without seeing as many excuse me, as many body bags coming back. So if you have the number of people in the field, you spend less on them because you're paying them third world wages, you're not going to see quite the outrage, you know, in the United States as you saw in Vietnam. I think I might stop there so I can cough. Let's see if we can actually show you a few slides, and then I'll take questions. I wonder if I can have a volunteer to go actually open that computer. Oh, I think Megan's back there is volunteering. These slides are just some pictures that I took. Oh, okay. So these are pictures that I took when I was in Iraq, and it's just some illustration of some of what I said to you. Nothing new or revolutionary here. So we'll skip through about 30 slides here. And there are actually a couple of videos, but we don't have audio, so I don't think you'll be able to see that. So, cover the book, which you're all encouraged to buy, and I will sign books later. And I think you can just press okay. This is an interesting slide. You probably recognize the man in the middle. The man in the middle is Dick Cheney. And here he is at a meal served by and cooked by Halliburton's workers. This is, actually, I arrived in that mess 2 weeks later, and I found the photograph. The Pentagon allows journalists access to the database, and I found this picture. I even have a video of him serving himself, you know, hash browns and bacon, but it would take a few minutes to set that up. So there he is, and he's actually sitting next to an Indian-American soldier. Let's go to the next one. This is, again, this is what would have been called a mess in Vietnam, but is today called a dining facility. And you have soldiers sitting here, and they're being, you know, they get to eat whatever they want. And I think what comes up next is probably the menu. So let's go to the next one. This is a menu, and I don't know if you can read it carefully, that easily. But if you can, this is a menu for an ordinary day in Iraq. Now, mind you, just because I know, you know, people will say to me, well, wait a second, this is not true at the combat outpost, you know, right, you know, in the middle of the desert. That's true, but for 100,000 soldiers who never leave their bases, this is your daily fare at a big base. This is the biggest base. So for lunch and breakfast, can you read, can people read the, it's not, well, you probably just have to take my word for it, but, oh, well, if somebody wants, anybody, you can read it. If you read, it's hard for me to see from over here. But
beef, pork, sausage.
Actually, let me read you. I have a menu here, actually. I forgot. I have a menu right here. So let me just read for you. This is a Thanksgiving menu. I was worried that might not show up. This is the Thanksgiving menu in Bagram, Afghanistan. Featured glazed ham, turkey, roast beef, cornbread stuffing, simmered corn. Thank you. Giblet gravy, ground gravy, pumpkin pie, sweet potato pie, cheesecake, chocolate cake, blueberry pie, and hot fresh rolls. Any given day, you can have 5 kinds of ice cream. So it is a very different military. Let's skip through. Actually, the next one will be easier to read. The next one, every week on Monday they have an Indian night, and so you can have, and of course all the cooks are Indian. So this is easy: chicken curry, trout, vegetable curry, beef palau, what have you. You can see that. The next one's an Easter menu, I think. So this is a special Easter menu. I love the chocolate-covered bunnies. I missed that. I got that a couple of weeks after Easter. Let's go to the next one. Thank you. This is actually a cake that was, I think it's a Thanksgiving cake that was made by the Indian cooks. Let's go to the next one. We can go through this fairly quickly. This is a Thanksgiving tableau provided by the workers of KBR, where they dressed up in Thanksgiving costumes. Let's go to the next one. So another thing that KBR runs is recreational facilities. So this is a swimming pool run by Halliburton. We'll go to the next one. These are kids who just come back from driving their trucks across Iraq. Let's go to the next one. This is the activities that happen at the recreational center, once again put on by the staff of Brown and Root. Now, I don't want to suggest that this means, you know, soldiers are living the high life, because they're not, but it is an attempt to create a sense of home on a military base in Iraq. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was when I talked to one of the soldiers in Anaconda. He was from Southern California, and I said to him, I said, so what do people say to you when you go out on the road and you drive through Iraq? He says, oh, the Iraqis are very happy. I said, well, okay, well, you're wearing you know, all your military gear, and you've got an M16, and you're driving a Humvee. Of course they're going to say you're happy. He said, no, that's not true. He says, even the Iraqis on the base are happy about what we're doing. So I was really confused by that. I said, but there are no Iraqis on the base. And he says, yes, yeah, the ones that clean the toilet and cook the food. I said, but they're Indian. But the reason I mentioned this was the total disconnect between people in Iraq and the soldiers, because they live in a bubble, and it's deliberate. I'm not trying to say that these soldiers are, you know, out there living their happy life and they're clueless. This is a very deliberate system created sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, for them to feel at home, because they are volunteers. They don't have to go to war. And the US military is finding it very hard to recruit soldiers. So they need to provide this. Let's go to the next one. That's just the movie. Thank you. That's just the movie schedule. You probably can't read it. That's a movie poster. So the regular movies, which is probably true in Vietnam and other wars too. These are the laundry machines. Once again, clothes are washed by KBR. This is an old aircraft hangar. Let's go to the next one. This is a rubbish dump operated by, it says KBR on it. Next one. These are the toilets that they run. Next one. These are the trucks by which they drive food up. And here's the thing is, in the book actually starts out with my, in an early part of the book, I talked to this driver. His name is Titoko Sabuati, and he's Fijian. And he was told that if he came to Iraq, he'd be paid $3,000 a month. So he thought, well, this is great. I'll be paid a lot of money. I'm going to go to Iraq. And when he arrived, he discovered he was being paid $180 to drive apple pie or steak or whatever it is through the desert of Iraq, be shot at by Iraqis and come back. $170. Now there's a base wage too, so at the end of the day maybe he makes $1,000 a month. When I met him a number of times, and he sang for me, we videotaped him and that sort of thing. And one day when I said goodbye to him, he dropped me off and he said, hey, can you give me 1 Kuwaiti dinar? And I said, sure. What do you need the money for? He said, well, I'd like to buy something to eat. Now, 1 Kuwaiti dinar is about $3.50. So it's just about enough for a meal in Kuwait. And I thought, this is incredibly tragic that this man is driving steak and apple pie, to soldiers 12 hours across Iraq, and he doesn't have the money to be able to buy himself a meal. Because when he drives in those, he can't eat at those dining facilities you see. He has to eat out in his truck. And he has to pay for his own food himself. We'll keep moving. This is the building of Anaconda, which is the biggest base in Iraq. And these slides actually provided to me by one of the engineers who helped design it, who became a whistleblower. We'll move on to the next slide. These are, again, just the construction and being built. This is in 2003. The next slide. Again, I don't know if you can read this. This is actually a poster that I saw in Iraq that I found. It's actually it's a recruitment poster from the Second World War, where First World War. Oh yeah, Persian, right, sorry. The First World War, where they're saying, come join us. This is a career for you now. Join the Quartermaster Battalion, I think it says, But those Quartermaster Battalions no longer exist. In your average dining facility, you have 208 people working there. 8 Halliburton supervisors, or KBR, about 25 soldiers, and 175 third country nationals. So it is primarily Third World workers who run these bases. Let's go to the next one. So this is the fusion center. This is where they manage all the logistics. And when I went there, of course, they turned off all their secret computers, the SIPRNet computers, and there are contractors sitting there managing how the things come in and out. And the contractors were asked to leave the room because we were journalists from Berkeley, so so they were like. The guy actually sitting on the left, he said, don't forget when you go back, tell the people of Berkeley that we're protecting them. So I'm going to be speaking in Berkeley next week, so I'm going to make sure to tell the people of Berkeley that. Let's go to the next slide.
Question, did the contractors also wear the uniforms, or they just...
The contractors they wear their own uniforms, but not military uniforms. They're not allowed to wear military uniforms. We're almost done. That's the only actual picture of a Halliburton sign that I ever found. So I liked it as a satellite dish. Let's keep going. This is these guys are the managers of the companies that bring the workers in. There's a couple of videos. So I think the next one might be a video. No, that's where the Halliburton managers stay in Kuwait in a resort. Let's go to the next one. This is a recruitment ad for Third World workers saying we'll pay you 325 KD, which is about $1,000 a month. That's not really true. I mean, they say that so that people come, 600 KD for a cook. Generally the wages are like half of that. I think the next one may be a video, and okay. Now these are the Indian workers in the kitchens serving food, or rather in the dining hall. The next one, okay. Now if you actually click on that, it'll play. You may not be able to hear the man, but it's not that important. I'll tell you what he says. He's basically saying, these are the workers who work for me. He says, and their names are Bob, Dave, George. He starts laughing, you know, because they've all been given, you know, American names, even though they're obviously all Indian. And then they take him, and you'll see in the video, even if you won't be able to hear him, he goes into their living quarters, and you'll see where they live. So he's taking a picture with them, and then they'll go in, and you'll see 12 people in a little room. Let's just wait for that. This is them keeping themselves warm around a fire. Because it gets pretty cold, and if you're from India, an Iraqi winter, which is not worse than an Oregon winter, is something that you're really not used to. So I think coming up, he actually goes into, and we'll kind of, so he actually has a little video camera, and they invited him in to their quarters. So you'll go in and you'll see how they live.
Half the size of a Walmart parking lot. I was surprised that you could put 12 men in such a small place.
So next time I'll bring an audio cable or something. That's what, and he'll go in. So you have, you know, 12 people sleeping in this room. It's very shaky video, so you can see them stacked up. Now, again, I also want to emphasize this is not just the U.S. military. This is true anywhere anywhere in Kuwait or Bahrain, any of the Gulf states, and until quite recently would probably have been true for farm workers here in the United States. I think there are strict rules that govern housing and that sort of thing these days, but I think as recently as probably 10, 20 years ago, and even now occasionally you will find conditions like this. So this is not something that's unique to the U.S. military. We'll stop there and I'll take questions.
You've been listening to investigative journalist and author Pratap Chatterjee talking about his latest book, Halliburton's Army: How a Well-Connected Texas Oil Company Revolutionized the Way America Makes War. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer segment from the presentation. Pratap Chatterjee has worked for many years in radio, print, and digital media, as global environment editor for Interpress Service, as host for a weekly radio program on community radio KPFA in Berkeley, California, and as a freelance writer for the Financial Times, The Guardian, and The Independent of London. He has won 5 Project Censored Awards for his investigative reporting, a Silver Reel Award from the National Federation of Community Broadcasters for his work in Afghanistan, and the Best Business Story Award from the National Newspaper Association. He has been a guest commentator on the BBC World Service, CNN International, Democracy Now!, Fox, and MSNBC. And he has served as board and staff member with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and Project Underground. He is currently the managing editor at CorpWatch. In addition to his latest book, he is also author of Iraq Incorporated, A Profitable Occupation, and The Earth Brokers, Power, Politics, and World Development. To find out more about Pratap Chatterjee and his work, please visit the CorpWatch website at www.corpwatch.org. And now we return to the question and answer segment from the presentation. Pratap Chatterjee spoke at Powell's City of Books in downtown Portland on February 18, 2009.
So the question is, do the British and other members of the coalition of the willing have the same system of not having quartermaster battalions and use workers from third world countries? Well, it's called the coalition of the willing, but as we all know, it is actually run by the US. Everything is managed by the US, and the US provides services to everybody else. So even if you're a British soldier, you're still part of the coalition, and therefore your food is provided by the American system. So it doesn't really matter where you're from, whether you're Polish or Latvian or British, you will still be served by the workers of KBR. I actually thought you were going to ask a different question, which I often mention, but I forgot to. I've been in Iraq, mostly not in the green zone, but in the red zone. And in talking to people in Iraq, people said, because I'm half Indian, half Sri Lankan. People say, the Indians have been coming to Iraq for a long time. They've built the roads here, and we remember in the 20s they came with the British, and thank you, they came with the British, and I said, oh, that's interesting. So the British Army actually had Indian soldiers who fought in the 1920s. So when I went back to India, I told my dad that, and I said, they told me that there were Indians here in the 20s, and he said, well, he says, your granduncle was one of them, and my granduncle was actually a medic who served in Iraq for the British Army. So that's not an answer to your question, but I mean, hopefully I did answer your question, which is there is a unified system that the Americans provide that everybody can avail themselves of. So to go into a dining facility, if you're a soldier and you have a CAT card, I think it's called, you can get food. If you're a contractor and your company is paid for it, you can get food. But if you haven't been paid for, such as you're a Fijian or Indian, you cannot eat in the Indian messes. You have to go eat at an Indian dining facility that may be provided to you by your company. Now the system breaks down when the contracts don't work out. So actually this past December, there was a group of workers who were brought in, I think from Sri Lanka, and they were brought in, and then the contract was cancelled when they arrived. And the contractor was hoping he'd get another contract, so he didn't send them back, he kept them there. So they lived in a warehouse for a couple of months, and finally they went out on protest. And they were living in a warehouse, cooking, on a open fire, living in the middle of the Iraqi desert, inside a base. I don't mean right out in the open. So the U.S. contracts with KBR. KBR contracts with a company like Prime Projects International in Dubai. One of the men that you saw worked for PPI. And they then hire a company in Manila, which then hires people to go into Pampanga and recruit people from the villages to come out there. So at some point, any form of control or accountability disappears, because the worker pays somebody in his village or her village $4,000 and then goes to Manila and then to Kuwait. And so by the time they get there, it's no longer, the US military says, well, what can we do? We hired KBR, we expect them to treat their workers right, but this is not our problem, that's their problem. The question is about the creation of Brown and Root and Halliburton, and how corruption was at the very beginning of this company, and whether or not it is still true today whether there's corruption in military contracts. In giving these talks about this book, I've focused on who Halliburton's Army is and the transformation of the military itself. But the book itself actually goes quite a lot into corruption, overcharging, profiteering, the rapes, all these other things that, the failed oil contracts, all that's in the book, but hard to do in like half an hour or so. So just to answer that question, Earl Halliburton was the man who founded Halliburton. When he founded the company, he actually stole the technology on which the company was based. It was a man called Perkins in California who invented this technology called oil well cementing. But Perkins wasn't a very good businessman, and Halliburton tried to convince him to change the way he marketed his business. He never did it. So he took that technology and he went to Oklahoma, to Duncan, Oklahoma. He founded a company there, and when he founded that company, he made a lot of money. And then eventually he was sued by Perkins, and he settled with Perkins and paid him back. One of the places, as I started my talk, one of the places that of course is well known that Brown and Root was involved in paying off politicians was of course in the Vietnam War, when Lyndon B. Johnson admitted to his biographers later that there was all cash. That when he was trying to win an election, he would call on Brown and Root, and Brown and Root would, George Brown actually, not the company, but George Brown, and George Brown had a system of paying off lawyers by which bags of money were brought and paid out to people. And he says to this guy, and I quote this in the book, he says, it was all cash. We only dealt in cash. So today, is there corruption? Absolutely there is. But I would say there's more waste than there is, major corruption. I don't have any evidence that, Cheney got paid off. And the thing is, today, partly because it's so much harder, the systems of corruption are far more sophisticated. So you start off with somebody at the very bottom. I'll give you an example. There's a guy in the book who got $1 million check. He was working for Brown and Root, and he was in charge of giving out contracts. He gave out a contract to a guy called Ali Hijazi, a Kuwaiti Lebanese guy. It should have been for $600,000. They ended up charging $5.5 million. He left the company and he got a check for $1 million. And then when he came back from Ali Hijazi, he said, look, this guy's my friend. He gave me a check for $1 million. What's wrong with that? And he says, I didn't even try to hide it. And this is the amazing thing, is that today a lot of these things happen in the open. Now, somebody like Mazon was, I think, overwhelmed by all the money that he saw, and he realized there weren't a lot of controls, and so he took advantage of the system. The real people make it, and he got caught at it, and there are plenty of people who've gotten caught at it. The people who really make the money are the people at the very top who have a different system, and it's called the revolving door. So basically what happens is, there was a guy in one of those slides, I don't know if you noticed, he was sitting holding a satellite phone. So his name's Jim Spoor, and I'm not accusing Mr. Spoor of anything illegal, in fact, quite the opposite. Mr. Spoor worked in Guantanamo, where he was in charge of building the prisons on Guantanamo, and he worked for the Navy. And he oversaw, there was a Saudi company that was supposed to build these bases, these prisons, and they backed out when they heard they were going to be building prisons for Muslims on Guantanamo. They said, there's no way we're going to do it. So Spoor got his friend Toby, the guy on the next slide, to bring in workers from the Philippines. And they shipped them, to Guantanamo. They built these bases, and built these prisons rather. And then once Spoor concluded his contract with the Navy, when he finished his contract with the Navy, he got a job with, guess who? Kellogg Brown & Root, with Halliburton. And they hired him to go build Anaconda in Iraq. So he went from making whatever it was, $75,000 with the Navy, to making $150,000, and I don't know his salary, but doubled his salary by working for Halliburton. And at the top level of Halliburton or Brown & Root, every single person is ex-military, every single person, bar none. They all come with 30 years experience. So the moment you retire from the US military, especially if you've been a contracting officer, and remember, half of the military, half of government work is done by contractors today. And I'm not just speaking of the Pentagon. I'm talking about the Department of Health and Human Services, I'm talking about the FDA, everything. So people know that once they finish government service, if they play their cards right, they can go work for the people they once oversaw. And so this is no longer illegal. Cheney, for example, when he left Halliburton, was given I forget how much, close on $1 million that he decided to have paid out to him over 5 years so he could reduce his taxes. So none of this is strictly corruption, because I mean there's a difference between a system of law and a system of justice. And so under the law, if I take $1 million check, but I pay my taxes on it, and it is paid to me by a company, and it's on the books, this is no longer corruption. You and I may say this is unethical. You may say it's corrupt. And this is where the guys at the bottom, the Jeff Alex Mazons who cash $1 million checks, I mean, who goes and tries to cash $1 million check in a bank in Chicago? I mean, you've got to be a moron, because you're going to get caught, right? Anything over $10,000 immediately gets reported to the feds. But that's what he did. So you will not find a lot of examples of major corruption. What you will find is the revolving door. And that is really the critical difference here. So question over here. The question really is about whether or not Lyndon B. Johnson got Brown & Root started by giving them a contract for a dam. I forget the name of the dam. And the answer is you're mostly right. They're not entirely. Because they started before that, but it was one of the contracts that got them really going. The second part of the question is, isn't this really how the corporate system works? Is they make money off the public, off the taxpayer, and they really make the decisions as opposed to us. So the answer is Brown & Root actually got its start building roads in Texas in probably the 1915 or so. And Lyndon Johnson, who was a politician from Texas, as soon as he got to Washington, gave them, I think he was a representative. He couldn't have been a senator, he was a representative. So one of his first acts was to go and beg for money for this dam. And the dam was completely, was sold on completely false pretenses. Its purpose was false, but it was also supposed to be part of the New Deal. It was supposed to be giving jobs to workers employed by the government. And so when they signed the contract for the dam, they said, well, wait a second, this is a private company we're giving government money to. It's a little like the stimulus bill today. It was the same kind of thing. And But the thing is that George Brown had Lyndon B. Johnson in his pocket. And so throughout his career, I mean, as first I think a state politician, and then as a member of the House of Representatives, and then eventually president, they maintained a very close relationship. And if you go to any major company, any company that gets contracts in the US will have on its board of advisors people who once worked at the Pentagon or the FDA or or NASA or whatever it is. And that's really the only way you get contracts. If you're a small company, you don't have people on your board, and therefore you don't get contracts, right? It's sort of a catch-22. If you want contracts, you need to hire the people who understand how the system works. And so, do they make the decisions? That's sort of in the eyes of the beholder. Do corporations run the United States? Well, you could argue that. I mean, you could also see it as sort of a cabal where they work hand in hand with each other. I personally think it's just nepotism. These people go to the same colleges, they belong to the same societies, and so they don't necessarily see it as something that's evil. They just say, I have a contract to give out. Well, let me give it to somebody who I think can do a good job. And it's my buddy who went to Princeton. However that may work. The other thing is, in order to be able to get these contracts, you need to understand how the government contracting system works. And that is not easy. The government has a contracting system, it's called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and it's 2,000 pages of very mind-numbing detail. And in order to be able to understand how that works, you pretty much have to be a contracting officer for the Pentagon. So as soon as you retire, you're going to get a job there. So it is kind of an integrated system. The tragedy, as we privatize and outsource more, it's going to stay within a small family of companies because they're the only people who really know how to get the contracts. A lot of people say, why did Brown and Root get the contract in the first place? Why not somebody else? Was it Cheney? And they say, did Cheney give Brown and Root the contract? And I say, you really need to ask the opposite question, is why did Halliburton hire Cheney in the first place? And again, it's the revolving door. It's the same set of people that, give contracts to each other. A couple of questions in the back. Okay, far back. We'll just go on. So the question is, if you have a project of this scope, who can you call on other than Brown and Root to do this kind of work? And it's a good question. And the answer is, in some ways there are many companies, in some ways there's only one company. If you're talking about an engineering project, building a military base, there are many companies, the Bechtels of San Francisco, the Parsons of Pasadena, the CH2M Hills, there are Fluors. There are many companies that build large dams, that build, subway systems. So if it's an engineering job you're talking about, there are dozens of companies out there. But if you're looking for a company that has security clearance, that has worked in a war zone before, that has people in the military, you only have one company, and that's Brown and Root. So you're absolutely right that if this was a no-bid contract initially when they invaded Iraq, but really there was nobody else they could go to. And as I said in the early part of the talk, that the first major logistical contract, and not base building contract, was actually given by the Clinton administration. So you can't say, Cheney invented this thing. It is really a continuum. So there are a lot of engineering companies out there that can do work all over the world, but if you're looking for work on a military base, Brown and Root is one of the few companies. And that is the problem with the system, is in order to have, for capitalism to work, you actually need to have a system of competition. And that has not been created. They're starting to do that now. They've actually broken up this contract is called LOGCAP, the Logistics Civilian Augmentation Program. It has been broken up into 4 parts. So there's some competition being introduced into the system. But remember, these are big contracts. These are 10-year contracts. The current contract is a $150 billion contract. You can't, if tomorrow Obama said, I want to cancel this contract, it takes 2 years to negotiate a replacement contract. And if they were to award it to a company run by you and me, it would be protested immediately under rules set out in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which would take 6 months to go through. There are people who have contested bids literally out of a home in New Jersey saying, I should have gotten this contract. And the Army spent 6 months trying to figure out and go through the rules to do it again. So it's a fairly complicated process, and the only people who can actually sustain that are the people who have the armies of lawyers and former contracting officers that can do that. And that really boils down to Brown and Root. Question? Okay, Sure. Well, the gentleman in front, and then you next. Yeah.
The next question for the author was about who had manufactured the trucks in the motor pool shown in the slide.
Yes, they're manufactured in Germany. They were Mercedes-Benz trucks. And there's actually an interesting story with those particular trucks. I made that reference to the fact that the company that applied for the contract had used fraudulent means. The company, you see on the trucks, it says PwC. The company is now called Agility. PwC was Public Warehousing Corporation of Kuwait. And it had maybe $10 million in revenue in 2001. You know, literally, it was actually a partly privatized state company. Today, it is among the top 10 logistic companies in the world. Its revenue is over $5 billion a year. And it was created entirely because of the war in Iraq. So a lot of companies have been created. There's so much money in this system. You know, if you know how to get the contracts, you can get it. So when they applied for that trucking contract, there were a couple of them. Those may have been prime vendor trucks, and I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but one of the contracts, which is called Heavy Lift 6, they said they had 1,000 trucks, reefers, lowboys. These are kinds of trucks. Lowboys are, what are lowboys? I don't know what it's, the English, these are just the terms the truckers use. Do anybody know what a lowboy?
It's a flat frame.
It's a big flatbed truck. So they said they had 1,000 of these trucks. Now these are not cheap trucks. These are $100,000 trucks. They didn't have them. They borrowed them, and I know the guy who borrowed the trucks from everybody else in the vicinity. And then when the military came over, they said, look, we've got 1,000 trucks. And so then they won the contract, and then they called Mercedes-Benz, and they had Mercedes-Benz shut down one of its plants for 6 months to build those, not for 6 months, like 4 months, to build those trucks that they needed. So the trucks you saw were built on special order. I forget where in Germany. It's in the book, I think. So yeah. So that's an interesting little detail. The lady behind you. What the lady was asking is that these companies, you know, have large systems where they train people in California to be able to move large amounts of equipment so they can do work for the military. Guard dogs. I'm not really familiar with the guard dog training system. But I will say, there is one thing that I always mention that I forgot to mention, is these contracts are what are called cost plus. And this is a very important concept, and I'm sorry I didn't start out talking about this. When you get a contract from the US military in a war zone, they guarantee you that you will be paid for whatever you spend, so long as you follow the federal acquisition regulations, right? So if you spend $100, you get that $100 back, and you get a profit. And that profit in Bosnia and Kosovo, for example, for KBR, for the Halliburton subsidiary, was of the order of 7 to 9%. So you have built in, and I'm simplifying this a little bit, a system there's an incentive to overspend. Because if you have $100 and you're guaranteed $8 profit, you know, all you have to do is spend $400 and you get $32. And literally people have said, a guy I knew said, you know, he wanted to order 1 forklift truck, and his supervisor said just order 4. You know, it's cost plus, who cares, you know? So it doesn't matter that the other 3 forklift trucks are not being used, the profit is guaranteed. Now, I'm simplifying it a lot because the military has systems to try and catch you if, you know, you overspend and you have vouchers you have to spend. But the tricky thing is those vouchers, that system of cost control is actually run by contractors. So it is, the whole system has completely been privatized. And so you also have a whole system of commercial logistics that now is so much more sophisticated than when the military used. And I don't want to get into the detail of break bulk pallets and moving containerization, but in some respects, answering your question, is commercial truckers with globalization, commercial shipping companies have systems in place that far outpace anything the US military has. Once upon a time, the US military moved far more than anybody else could even conceive of. Now the military is actually among a smaller, you know, system of moving goods, where now, you know, we have flowers shipped, you know, directly, you know, flown in, or wood chips, you know, from the Oregon and Washington coast, you know, being shipped to Japan to be, you know, cut into chopsticks. Everything is containerization. The military takes advantage of these commercial systems And so tomorrow, if Obama decides he's going to shut down the war and bring everybody home, unless, of course, they leave everything behind, which they're not going to do. You know, you have these $57 million F-18Es, you have these containerized kitchens. You know, they're going to bring everything back, and that contract is going to KBR. It's going to go back to the former subsidiary of Halliburton because they have the systems to move everything back. Back there, and one more question. Okay, the gentleman in the back's been waiting very patiently. So the question is, how are the workers, the third country nationals, I assume, on the military bases treated differently from American soldiers or Americans on the base? And the answer is absolutely. No, you cannot go, if you mentioned the swimming pools, if you're an Indian worker working for Halliburton, if you're an Indian journalist or if you're an Indian soldier, you could use the pool. But if you're a third country national, you cannot use a swimming pool that is reserved for the use of the US military. You cannot, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot eat in the same dining halls. You may cook that food. Well, actually, the people who cook the food can eat in those messes. But the people who clean the toilets cannot eat in those dining facilities. They can only eat in their own Indian dining facilities. If you're injured and you're a contractor, you do not get treated on a US military base. You know, if your life depends on it, they probably will treat you. They have very sophisticated medical systems by which they'll replace half your brain, give you a plastic leg, and 5 times as many soldiers today survive as did in Vietnam. I forget what the exact statistic is. But if you're an Indian or Pakistani or Sri Lankan worker, you get shipped home if you get injured. And this is true anywhere in the region, is your the medical facilities available to you are basically an aspirin and probably a anti-diarrheal tablet. So you will not get treated there. You technically are supposed, under US law, to have an insurance under it's called the DBA insurance, the Defense Base Act. Requires every contractor, no matter if they're a subcontractor, to have insurance in case they get injured or lose their lives or some such thing. In reality, a lot of the contractors don't provide that. And so if you get injured, you go home, end of story. You might get a small payment, and that's it. And that's even true there. I know American workers who've come back and the company didn't buy the insurance, so they're supposed to. The insurance is mostly provided by a company that many of you have heard of, AIG. So that always gets a laugh. So that was the last question, I guess. Okay, well, thank you. You can stick around, ask me more questions. I'll sign books.
You've been listening to investigative journalist and author Pratap Chatterjee talking about his latest book, Halliburton's Army: How a Well-Connected Texas Oil Company Revolutionized the Way America Makes War. To find out more about Pratap Chatterjee and his work, please visit the CorpWatch website at www.corpwatch.org. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find on-demand streaming audio and video programs featuring speakers such as Father Roy Bourgeois, Susan Faludi, Barbara Ehrenreich, Rashid Khalidi, Amira Haas, Noam Chomsky, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.